They left me at the hospital again after rebirth. I paid private nurses and vanished. The fluorescent light above bed 14 had a flicker in it, a stutter so small, most people would never notice. But I had been staring at it for 6 hours, and I knew its rhythm the way you know a song you hate. Flicker. Hold. Flicker. Is anyone coming to sit with you tonight, Mrs. Larkin? The nurse asked it gently, the way you ask a question you already know the answer to, the way you check a box you've already checked in your head. Her name was Denise. I remembered that later. Denise, 40-something, kind eyes, a wedding ring she kept turning with her thumb when she was uncomfortable, which was often in my room. He's on his way, I said, because that was what I always said. Because that was what I believed still in that life, in that version of the night. I was 34 years old, and I still believed my husband when he told me he was on his way. I had come out of surgery 4 hours earlier, a resection, routine as these things go, except nothing about my body had ever been routine. The flares came and went on a schedule only my own cells understood. My kidneys had opinions about it. My joints kept a ledger. And the surgeon had said the words, some risk of post-operative complications in the specific tone doctors use when they want you to hear it without making you afraid. I heard it. I wasn't afraid. I had Daniel's name in my phone under favorite. And I believed with the total embarrassing faith of a woman who has spent 12 years building a life around a man that faith would be rewarded with presence. I texted him at 6. Out of surgery, doing okay, groggy. Can you come? He read it at 6:14. I watched the little blue checkmark appear like a held breath. At Mom's B-Day dinner, can I come after? She's already asking why I'm on my phone. I typed, okay, because there was nothing else to type. Because in 12 years of marriage, I had learned that the sentence I need you landed on Daniel like an accusation, and the sentence okay landed like relief. And I had gotten so good at giving him relief that I'd forgotten what I was owed in return. By 9, no one had come, not Daniel, not Carol, his mother, who had raised him to believe that his comfort was a kind of family currency more valuable than anyone else's need. Not Priya, his sister, who had never in her life sat in a hospital chair for anyone but herself. My own parents were gone. My mother 9 years dead, my father before that, and the friend I might have called Sujin was 3 states away at a conference I'd told her not to miss on my account. Because that was the kind of wife and friend and daughter and sister-in-law I had made myself into, the one who says, don't worry about me, I'm fine, go, I'll be fine. I want to be honest about how ordinary it felt in the moment to be alone in that bed. That's the hardest part to explain to anyone who hasn't lived inside a marriage like mine. It didn't feel like an emergency. It didn't even feel at first like neglect. It felt like Tuesday. It felt like every other night of 12 years distilled into its purest form. Me waiting, telling myself the waiting was reasonable, that his mother's birthday really did matter, that I really was strong enough not to need him, because I had spent over a decade proving exactly that, over and over, until proving it had become the only love language I knew how to speak. I scrolled through old photos to pass the time. Our wedding, 11 years back. Daniel in a rented tux that fit him better than anything he'd bought since. A trip to the coast the year before the business took off, when he still brought me coffee in bed on Sundays, before Sundays became permanently reserved for his mother's table. I found myself smiling at some of them, even that night, even with a fever starting to build behind my eyes, because that is the cruelest trick a slow-dying marriage plays on you. It doesn't erase the good years, it just makes you spend the bad ones mining them for proof that the good ones might still come back. By 10, a resident I hadn't met came by to check my incision and asked, almost as an afterthought, whether I had someone at home who could help me change the dressing over the next few days. I said yes. I did not say that yes meant a man who was, at that exact moment, 3 miles away, cutting into a sheet cake shaped like a golf club because his mother had decided this year that 61 called for a golf theme. By 11, my fever had started to climb, and Denise, running her rounds, caught it on the monitor before I felt it myself. That specific electric fog that comes right before your body decides to stop cooperating with your plans. By 1 in the morning, the fever had become something else. A word I would come to know intimately in my second life, the way you know an enemy's face. Sepsis. It happens fast when it happens. It happens faster when there's no one in the room advocating, no one pressing the call button on your behalf, because you yourself can no longer form the thought, no one telling the night shift doctor she said this earlier. She said her chest hurt. Please look again. because the truth about hospitals that no one tells you until you're inside one, truly inside one alone, is that the system runs on advocates. It runs on someone in the room who loves you enough to be annoying. And I had no one in the room. I remember texting Daniel one last time, somewhere around midnight, my thumbs clumsy against the screen, the message barely coherent. Not feeling right, can you come? I remember watching it sit there, delivered, unread, the little gray timestamp mocking me with its ordinariness. Because somewhere 3 miles away, a room full of people I loved, or had trained myself to love, was singing happy birthday to a woman who had never once in 12 years sung it to me. I remember, near the end, the particular sound the machines make when they decide to stop being patient with you. I remember Denise's face, no longer gentle, sharp now, shouting a number into the hallway. I remember thinking with a strange calm that I now understand was my body's last kindness to me. He's still at the birthday dinner. And then, I didn't think anything at all. I woke up to the flicker. Flicker, hold flicker. Same light, same ceiling tile with the water stain shaped like Florida. Same beeping, steady now, not urgent. I lay there for a long moment, convinced I had dreamed the whole thing. The fever, the shouting, the terrible falling away sensation of a body giving up its lease on a life, until Denise walked in, turning her wedding ring with her thumb, and said, in the exact same gentle, box-checking voice, "Is anyone coming to sit with you tonight, Mrs. Larkin?" I did not answer for a long moment. I was doing the math a human brain is not built to do quickly. This is the same day. This is the same hour. I am back in the same bed, in the same body, with the same catheter taped to the same arm. And somehow I remember all of it, the fever, the dying, and everything after, years of it, unspooling behind my eyes like a film reel someone had rewound and handed back to me along with the ticket stub. I remembered Daniel's affair, which started that spring with a woman from his gym, a woman named Ashley who wore the specific shade of highlighter he liked to pretend he'd never noticed on anyone. I remembered the exact conversation, 11 months from now, where Carol convinced him it wasn't really cheating if it happened during a rough patch, as though the rough patch hadn't been manufactured entirely by his own negligence. I remembered the $41,200 that disappeared from the business account over 14 months, siphoned out in increments small enough that my accountant, who I would later learn Carol had personally recommended and personally had lunch with twice a month, never flagged them as unusual. I remembered Priya borrowing my car for a swim meet and returning it 3 days later with the front bumper crumpled and a story about some guy who backed into me in a parking lot. Don't worry, I got his insurance. A story that was, I now knew with total certainty, a complete fabrication. There had been no other car. There had been Priya on her phone on a road with a hard curve she'd taken at 55. I remembered the divorce filing eventually, and the specific cruelty of watching Daniel's lawyer argue that my business, the business I had built with my own hands from a single catering contract at 26 into something that employed 9 people by 32, was a marital asset because he had, and I quote the deposition I would give 3 years from now, supported her emotionally during its formation. I remembered dying too the second time, 4 years from now, quietly, in a different hospital, of complications from an illness that had been mismanaged for years because no one in my life had ever once sat across from a doctor and asked the follow-up question. Because I had trained everyone around me through years of, I'm fine, don't worry, go, to believe that my body was a low-priority item on an infinite list of other people's needs. All of it. Every betrayal, every date, every dollar amount, every lie told in a tone soft enough to sound like love, sitting in my chest like a second, heavier heart. I remember the specific, physical sensation of it more than anything else. Not fear, though I expected fear, but a kind of pressure like surfacing too fast from a great depth. My whole body registering the return of 4 years of weight all at once. My hands were shaking on top of the blanket. I stared at them like they belonged to someone else, this 34-year-old woman's hands, unlined in the particular way mine had not been by the time I died the second time, and I thought, with a clarity that frightened me more than the dying had, I know how this ends if I let it happen again. Not as a warning, as a fact filed away and retrievable, the way you know the ending of a book you've already read and are now being asked, impossibly, to read a second time with the chance to change the last chapter. I thought, absurdly, of my mother. dead 9 years by then in whichever life I was currently occupying. And the things she used to say when I was small and had done something wrong and come to her, already knowing the shape of my own punishment. You don't get extra credit for seeing it coming if you don't do anything different. I hadn't understood it as a child. I understood it now with a violence that nearly took my breath away a second time. Denise was still standing there, pen against her clipboard, waiting. "No," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "No one's coming." She softened, the way people do when they think they're witnessing sadness instead of the birth of something else entirely. "That's all right, sweetheart. We'll take good care of you." "I know you will," I said. And I meant it because I remembered her too. Denise, who would check on me twice as often as her rounds required that whole miserable, lonely week 4 years ago, who would sneak me extra pudding cups and call me sweetheart in a voice that meant it. "Actually, is there a phone charger somewhere? Mine's about to die." "Of course." She found one in the drawer under the television, the hospital's own, a little frayed at the plug. "There you go." "Thank you," I said. And when she left, I lay in the dark, with the charger humming quietly into my phone. And I did not cry. And I did not call Daniel. And I did not do any of the things the old me, the dead me, the me from the version of this night that had already happened and unhappened, would have done. I opened my phone. I found the number for a private duty nursing agency I remembered, dimly, from an ad I'd scrolled past 100 times without registering. Back when I was the kind of person who thought private nursing was for other people, richer people whose families didn't show up either, but who could at least buy the appearance of being cared for. I was going to become that kind of person. Starting tonight. Before I called the agency, I almost called Sujin. My thumb hovered over her name for a long moment, and I want to be honest that some old, exhausted part of me wanted, more than anything, to hear a voice that already knew me, to say out loud to someone, "I think I just died and came back and I remember everything, and I don't know what to do with that." But I didn't call her, not that night. I told myself it was because it was 2 a.m. and she had an early flight home from the conference, and that was true, but it wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I needed for once in my life to make the first decision of this new chapter completely alone, without shaping it around what anyone else, even someone who loved me, might need me to be. I had spent 12 years building my choices around other people's comfort. This first one, was going to be mine and only mine. So instead of calling anyone who loved me, I called strangers. I called people whose entire job was to show up for money because at least then I would know precisely and without ambiguity exactly what I was paying for and exactly what I could expect in return. There was something almost peaceful in that transaction. No guilt to manage. No performance of gratitude required to keep the relationship afloat. Just a service, rendered on time because I had paid for it to be. The woman who answered the after-hours line for Halcyon Home Health sounded surprised to be getting a call at 1:40 in the morning from a hospital room, but she recovered fast, the way people in service industries learn to. "We can have someone to you by 6 a.m., she said. "Is this for post-operative care or—" "Both," I said. Post-operative and companion care. I need someone who can be in the room, advocating, someone who will ask the doctors follow-up questions, push back if something seems off, that kind of thing." I heard myself say it and felt something unclench in my chest that had been clenched, I realized, for 12 years. "I don't have anyone else." "Of course," she said, gentle now. The same gentleness Denise had used. Except this gentleness came with a price list, and I had never in my life been so relieved to see a price list. "We do have a premium tier, a dedicated nurse, 12-hour shifts, someone who'll be your point of contact with the medical staff directly. It runs—" "I don't need the number," I said. "I need the nurse." I gave her my card. I gave her the room number. I hung up and lay back against the pillow and looked at the flickering light and thought, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I am going to be okay. Not because someone else had promised it, but because I had just made it true with my own 2 hands. By 6:15, a woman named Rosa arrived, mid-50s, compact and unhurried in the specific way of people who have spent decades in emergency rooms and learned that panic helps no one. She introduced herself, checked my chart, asked Denise 3 questions I would never have thought to ask, and pulled a chair up beside my bed like she intended to stay there, which she did, for the next 6 hours, and then the 6 after that and the 6 after that. I watched Daniel's texts arrive throughout the morning. Hey, how you feeling? Sorry I couldn't make it last night. Mom's dinner ran long. I'll swing by tonight. And I felt the old ache reach for me, the 12-year groove worn into my chest that wanted to text back it's okay and mean it. I did not text back it's okay. I texted back, glad you had a nice night. He didn't catch the edge in it. He never did. That had always been part of the problem. Daniel had never once in 12 years been fluent in the language of my disappointment, because I had never once let it show plainly enough for a man who wasn't looking very hard to see it. He showed up 2 days later on a Thursday, holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations still wrapped in the plastic sleeve, the receipt visible in the cellophane fold, $12.99. And I recognized the store, and I recognized with a clarity that would have been impossible to me 4 years ago and now felt as ordinary as breathing, that he had put it on the business credit card. Our business credit card. The one tied to the account that fed our household, our mortgage, and soon, though he didn't know it yet, nothing of his at all. I watched him come through the door and felt, for one unguarded second, the old reflex rise up in me. The automatic softening, the readiness to make this easy for him, to say it's okay, you're here now, that's what matters. Before he'd even finished apologizing, the way I'd said some version of that sentence 1,000 times across 12 years, sanding down every one of his failures before they had the chance to leave a mark on either of us. I let the reflex rise, and then, for the first time in my life, I simply didn't act on it. I let the silence sit instead. It felt, in that moment, like holding my breath underwater, uncomfortable and unfamiliar, and entirely survivable. Hey, he kissed my forehead the way you kiss a relative you're fond of but not particularly attached to. You look better. I feel better, I said. And it was true. And it had nothing to do with him. Sorry about Tuesday. Mom gets so hurt if I'm not fully present. You know how she is. And I figured you were in good hands here anyway. He set the flowers on the rolling table, glanced around the room, and I watched something register on his face. Rosa, sitting in the corner with a folder of my discharge instructions and a look on her face that said she had already clocked exactly what kind of husband was walking into this room 2 days late with gas station flowers. Who's this? This is Rosa, I said. But she's my nurse. I hired her. You hired her? Like, privately? He laughed. A short, surprised sound, not unkind exactly. Just the laugh of a man encountering a fact about his wife that didn't fit the file he kept on her in his head. Since when do we do that? Since Tuesday, I said, and I smiled at him. The same smile I'd been giving him for 12 years, and inside that smile, for the first time, there was nothing at all. I should explain before I go any further what I actually knew. The full weight of the 4 years I was carrying around now, folded up small enough to fit behind an ordinary Tuesday smile. I knew about Ashley from the gym, whose real name, it would turn out, was Ashley Kowaltisk, 31, a spin instructor with a laugh Daniel would later describe to a marriage counselor as just really easy to be around. As though ease were a virtue and not simply the absence of anyone asking him to be better. In the life I remembered, it started in April, 4 months after this hospital stay, with a smoothie she recommended after his 6 a.m. class and a phone number scrawled on the back of a receipt he forgot was in his gym bag for 3 weeks before I found it doing laundry. It never became a grand passion. That was almost the worst part. It was small and lazy and convenient, the kind of infidelity that doesn't even have the decency to be dramatic. Just a man reaching for the nearest source of attention because the source he already had at home had stopped, somewhere along the way, expecting to be reached for at all. I knew about the money before I ever had proof of it, because I had lived 4 more years past this one and watched the proof arrive too late to matter. Carol had been added to the business checking account back when I was 28, 3 years into building the company, at a moment when I was drowning. New commercial kitchen lease, 2 employees I couldn't yet really afford, morning sickness from a pregnancy that didn't take, and Carol, in what looked at the time like generosity, had offered to help with the books for a few months, just until things settle. Things never settled. The access never got revoked because revoking it would have meant a confrontation, and I had spent my entire marriage avoiding confrontations the way other people avoid live wires. In the life I remembered, by the time I really noticed, sat down with a forensic accountant and looked, Carol had moved just over $41,000 out of that account over 3 years, always in amounts small enough to look like the ordinary friction of a family business. A loan here that never got repaid, and investment there in a candle business Priya abandoned within 6 months, a gift to herself on an anniversary no one else in the family had been told was being celebrated. I knew about the car before Priya ever got behind the wheel of mine again, because I had already watched her do it once. A Tuesday in November, a swim meet 2 towns over, a curve on Route 9. She'd taken at 55 with her phone propped against the dash, texting a boy who would dump her 3 weeks later anyway. In my old life, I believed her story about the parking lot for over a year because believing her cost me nothing but $4,000 in bodywork, and because doubting her would have meant doubting the whole fragile architecture of a family that ran entirely on everyone agreeing not to look too closely at each other. I knew most of all what it felt like to spend 12 years as the load-bearing wall of a house I didn't get to decorate. I knew the specific exhaustion of being loved conditionally, contingent on my continued willingness to need nothing, and I knew that no amount of loving them harder, more patiently, more selflessly, had ever once made any of it change. It had only ever made it worse, because every year I proved I could carry more was a year they learned they'd never have to help carry it. That knowledge sat in me now like ballast. It didn't make me bitter, exactly. Or it did for a while in the private hours, but bitterness on its own is just weight with nowhere to go. What it gave me mostly was patience. A very specific, surgical kind of patience. Because I finally understood something I hadn't understood the first time around. You cannot argue a person out of a pattern they've spent their whole life being rewarded for. You can only remove the reward. I want to tell you what the next 6 months looked like from the outside, because from the outside, nothing changed. That was the whole design of it. I still made Sunday dinner at Carol's house. I still complimented Priya's engagement ring, a modest thing Daniel's college roommate had picked out, nothing like what she'd eventually want and get once she learned what was coming. With real enthusiasm, because performing enthusiasm had never been hard for me. I'd had 12 years of practice. I still let Daniel believe that the business account, the one Carol had helped set up years ago with her own name quietly listed as a secondary signatory for emergencies, was the same account it had always been. It was not. There was a particular Sunday in February, maybe 6 weeks into this second life, that I still think about, one of those ordinary, forgettable dinners at Carol's that would have vanished entirely from my memory the first time around, folded into the general blur of 100 identical Sundays. Carol had made her pot roast, dry as always, and was holding court about a neighbor's landscaping choices while Priya scrolled through wedding venues on her phone under the table, not even bothering to hide it. Daniel reached over at one point and squeezed my hand, an absent, habitual gesture, the kind a man makes without thinking. Still fond of his wife in the vague, unexamined way you're fond of furniture you've never had reason to look at closely. I squeezed back. I asked Carol a follow-up question about the neighbor's hedges, and I meant the question, or at least performed meaning it convincingly enough that no one at that table, not one of them, could have told you that the woman passing the gravy boat had, 3 days earlier, sat in a lawyer's office reviewing a document that would strip every one of them of any future claim on the only thing I had ever built entirely by myself. That was the strangest part of the whole year, if I'm honest. Not the planning itself, which felt, in its way, almost soothing. The way any project with a clear structure feels soothing to a person who has spent a decade managing chaos. It was the performance of ordinariness around it. I learned to hold 2 entirely separate women inside my body at once. The one who laughed at Carol's jokes and refilled Priya's wine and asked Daniel about his fantasy football league with what looked from the outside like genuine interest, and the one underneath, running numbers, tracking dates, watching every gesture at that table for the small tells I now knew to look for. The way Carol's eyes moved to her phone, a beat too fast whenever the LLC came up in conversation. The way Priya's questions about wedding funding grew more specific and more confident. As the months went on, confidence built on money she believed, wrongly, was still there. I met Whitfield on a Tuesday in March, at a coffee shop 2 towns over from where anyone I knew would think to look for me, because I had learned, from 4 years of hindsight, that Carol had a habit of hearing things. From the dry cleaner, from the hairdresser, from a network of women in her social orbit who reported to her the way a hive reports to a queen. And I intended for her to hear nothing. Franklin Whitfield was an estate and business attorney Soo Jin's cousin had used for a divorce. A small, precise man in his 60s with reading glasses he wore on a chain and a manner of listening that made you feel, for the first time possibly ever, entirely taken seriously. I want to talk about a healthcare directive, I told him, which was true as far as it went. No one came when I was in the hospital. I want that to never happen again. I want someone with legal authority to make decisions for me who I actually trust. Understandable, Mus, he said, making a note. Who did you have in mind? My friend Soo Jin. Not my husband. He looked up at that just slightly, the way a good lawyer looks up when a client has said something that opens a door without meaning to, or meaning to very much and pretending otherwise. And is there anything else going on, he asked gently, that you'd like to talk about? Sometimes a healthcare directive is really the tip of a larger iceberg. I looked at this stranger, this careful, precise man who had no idea that I had died once already in a version of this year that had already happened and unhappened, who had no idea that I could recite from memory the exact routing number Carol would use 14 months from now to move $9,000 out of our business account into an LLC she'd register under Priya's name for wedding expenses disguised as catering consultancy fees. And I decided in that coffee shop to tell him everything I could tell him without sounding insane. I built a catering and events business from nothing, I said. It's worth close to $900,000 now, on paper, mostly in contracts and goodwill and a commercial kitchen lease I hold personally. My husband didn't build it. My mother-in-law is a secondary signatory on the business checking account. I didn't set that up. It happened before I was paying close enough attention, and I'd like it undone. I want the whole business restructured into something that can't be touched by my marriage, by my husband's family, by anyone but me and whoever I choose. I want it done quietly. I don't want anyone to know it's happening until it's already happened. Whitfield took off his reading glasses, folded them, and looked at me the way you look at someone who has just told you, calmly, that they've seen the future. That, he said, I can do. He set the glasses down on the table between us, precise, deliberate, the way I would come to learn he did everything. I want to be direct with you, Mrs. Larkin, because I think you'll appreciate directness more than comfort. What you're describing isn't unusual in itself, protecting a business from a troubled marriage, tightening up who has access to what. What's unusual is the specificity. You're not asking me hypothetical questions. You're speaking like someone who already knows exactly what's going to happen and is simply asking me to help her get ahead of it. I didn't answer right away. Outside the window, a woman walked past with a stroller, and I watched her for a moment longer than I needed to, buying myself time. Let's just say I've spent a long time watching this family operate, I said finally. I know their patterns better than they know them themselves. I'd like to stop being the only person who pays for that pattern. Fair enough, he said, and something in his face told me he'd decided not to push further. Not because he believed me entirely, but because he'd learned, across 4 decades of practicing law, that some clients come to him already knowing exactly what they need, and the job, in those cases, isn't to interrogate their certainty. It's to build the scaffolding around it. Then let's start with a trust structure. I'll need 3 years of financial records, the LLC documents for the catering business, and a very honest conversation about every person who currently has access to any part of it. If we're doing this quietly, we do it once and we do it completely. Half measures are what get discovered. I don't do half measures, I said. And it was, by then, the truest sentence I had spoken to anyone since waking up in that hospital bed. Over the following months, I became, without anyone in my life noticing, a different kind of woman entirely. Not on the surface, where I remained soft-spoken, accommodating, the reliable one who hosted every holiday and remembered every birthday, but underneath, where it mattered, where the actual architecture of a life gets built or dismantled. I moved the business into an irrevocable trust with Whitfield as trustee and myself as sole beneficiary, structured in a way. He explained this to me over 3 separate meetings, each one educating me in a language I had never had reason to learn, that made it, for legal purposes, no longer a marital asset subject to division, regardless of what happened to my marriage. I removed Carol as a signatory on the business account, quietly, during a routine annual review, and replaced the primary business bank with a new one across town. One Carol had no relationship with, no lunches scheduled with the branch manager, no favors banked. I kept the old account open with a small, unremarkable balance, and I let everyone continue to believe it was where the real money lived. I started a folder. Not a metaphorical one, an actual manila folder kept in a locked drawer at Whitfield's office that grew fatter every month. Screenshots of texts, dates, times the receipt from the hospital gift shop flowers, which I asked Denise, half joking, half not, to note in my discharge paperwork as no family present during recovery period, day 2. A copy of every unauthorized transaction Carol had ever made on the old account, going back 3 years, which I now knew to look for because I remembered, with total clarity, exactly which ones would eventually surface in a forensic accountant's report 4 years from now, in a life that technically hadn't happened yet, but that I carried around in my body like a scar from a wound not yet inflicted. I remember the specific vertigo of watching people I loved, or had trained myself to love in the specific, self-erasing way you love people who've taught you that your needs are optional, walk toward the exact same cliffs they'd walked toward before, except this time I could see the cliffs and they couldn't. And I said nothing, because saying something had never once, in 12 years, changed anything about how this family operated. Only proof changed things. Only leverage changed things. I had learned that the hard way, with my whole life, and I intended to spend the knowledge like the only inheritance I'd ever really been given. The car happened in November, exactly as I knew it would, down to the day. A Tuesday, a swim meet 2 towns over, Priya asking to borrow my car because hers was making a weird noise, a lie so thin I could have seen through it blind. In the life I remembered, I'd handed her the keys without a second thought and spent $4,000 fixing a bumper she'd crumpled, taking a curve on Route 9 too fast while texting a boy who'd dump her within the month. This time, I handed her the keys anyway. That detail mattered to me, letting her make her own choice rather than engineering her out of it. Because the plan was never about controlling other people's behavior, only about no longer absorbing the cost of it. But I'd quietly added a rider to my auto policy 2 weeks earlier, one that named any authorized driver's own insurance as primary in the event of an at-fault accident. A boring, technical little addition my agent barely blinked at. And I'd put a dash cam in the car, mounted low and unobtrusive on the windshield, the kind of thing you buy for peace of mind and never mention to anyone. She called me from the side of Route 9 at 6:40 that evening, crying, already reciting the parking lot story before I'd even asked a single question. Some other driver backed into her, drove off. So sorry, don't worry about the car, I'll handle it. I let her finish. I told her I was glad she was okay, which was true. And then, 3 days later, when the adjuster called to ask a few routine questions and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the dash cam footage showed no other vehicle anywhere near the car in the 20 minutes before the damage occurred. Only a single vehicle skid on a curve well within the posted limit for a driver paying attention to the road, I said only that I hadn't reviewed the footage myself and would leave it to the professionals. Priya's own insurance, the one I'd quietly made primary, absorbed the claim. She never learned I'd known. She never learned there'd been a camera. She simply learned for once in her life that a story doesn't always hold, and that lesson cost her nothing but a slightly higher premium and a very uncomfortable phone call with her own agent. A fraction of what it once cost me, and entirely finally hers to carry. There's a particular kind of loneliness in that, building an entire secret architecture around yourself while smiling across a dinner table at people who have no idea the ground beneath them has already shifted. I won't pretend it didn't cost me something. There were nights I sat in my car outside Whitfield's office and cried, not because I doubted what I was doing, but because some small, exhausted part of me still wished, even now, even knowing everything I knew, that I didn't have to do it alone, that someone in that family might have surprised me, might have shown up, unprompted, with something other than gas station flowers and an excuse. No one did. They never had. That was, in the end, the whole point. There were smaller victories that spring that I hoarded like coins. I caught the Blossom and Bright registration 2 weeks after Carol filed it, back when it was still just a name reserved with the Secretary of State's office and not yet a functioning fraud vehicle, and I did nothing about it. Did not confront her. Did not warn Daniel, did not so much as change the expression on my face at the following Sunday dinner, because I understood, in a way that would have been impossible for the old me to understand, that catching something too early only teaches a predator to be more careful. I wanted her comfortable. I wanted her confident. Confidence in a person who has never once been held accountable is the single most reliable weapon you can hand them against themselves. I renegotiated the commercial kitchen lease that April, a full 8 months before I remembered doing it the first time, because I now knew exactly which landlord in town was looking to offload a larger space at a rate that wouldn't make sense to anyone without my particular knowledge of his upcoming retirement plans. I hired our head pastry chef, Marisol, 6 months before she would otherwise have taken a job with a competitor, because I remembered, with the specific, useless-seeming precision of a woman who had once spent an entire dead marriage paying close attention to everyone except herself, that she'd mentioned once offhand wanting to move closer to her sister in the fall, and I made sure this time that closer to her sister and still working for me were not mutually exclusive. None of it looked, from the outside, like revenge. That was the design. It looked like a woman quietly getting her life in order after a health scare, the way people do. It looked like competence. Competence, I was learning, was the best disguise a plan like mine could possibly wear, because no one in that family had ever once thought to be suspicious of me being good at things. They had built their whole understanding of me around the assumption that my competence existed for their benefit. It took them a very long time to imagine it might exist for my own. The illness came back on schedule the way I knew it would, in September, 11 months into this second life, right on the exact week I remembered it hitting me the first time. A flare that put me back in a hospital bed with the same water-stained ceiling tile. Though this time I noted almost fondly that Denise had been promoted to charge nurse and only stopped by to say hello. This time I had already called Halcyon before I even checked into the ER. This time, the healthcare directive with Sujin's name on it was already on file, already scanned into the hospital's system, already the first thing any doctor saw when they pulled my chart. This time, when the intake coordinator asked, with the same box-checking gentleness Denise had once used, "Is there anyone we should call for you tonight?" I said, "Yes, call Rosa. She's on the contact sheet. She'll be here in 20 minutes. And she was. There is a specific quiet miracle in watching a system that once nearly killed you work exactly the way it's supposed to once someone finally hands it the right names in the right order. A doctor I'd never met came in at midnight, flipped through my chart, saw the directive, saw Rosa's credentials listed as my designated medical liaison, and addressed his questions to her as easily as he would have addressed them to a spouse. No hesitation, no confusion about who had standing in the room, because I had made sure months before I ever needed it that the paperwork left no ambiguity for anyone to exploit. When my potassium came back borderline and the resident wanted to keep an eye on it overnight, rather than treat it immediately, it was Rosa who asked the follow-up question I would once never have known to ask myself. What's the threshold where you'd intervene and who's checking the levels before then? And got a straight answer and a plan and an actual intervention 2 hours later before it became the kind of emergency that used to define my nights alone in rooms like this one. I lay there watching it happen and felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not just relief, but a strange retroactive grief for the woman who hadn't had this, who had lain in a bed just like this one, in another version of this exact month, and simply trusted that the system would catch what she couldn't catch herself, because no one had ever taught her that trust in a hospital is not a virtue. It's a gamble, and gambles need advocates standing behind them to have decent odds. Daniel found out I was in the hospital from a group text I sent to the whole family at 9 that night, 3 hours after I'd been admitted, worded with total, deliberate blandness. Quick update. I'm at Providence for a flare-up. Should be discharged in a day or two, all handled. Don't want anyone to worry or rearrange plans. I watched the read receipts populate. Carol read it at 9:04 and did not respond. Priya read it at 9:41, mid-scroll through something else clearly, and sent a single red heart emoji. Daniel read it at 10:15 and called me. "Why didn't you call me right away?" There was something almost wounded in his voice, which struck me, even then, as extraordinary. That the man who had left me alone to die once already in a life he would never remember and could never be held accountable for, was capable of sounding hurt that I hadn't centered him fast enough in my own emergency. I didn't want to interrupt anything. I said, which was true, and also a knife with the handle turned toward him so he couldn't feel the blade going in. I would have come. "You're at Priya's engagement party," I said. "I saw the pictures on Carol's page an hour ago. You looked like you were having a great time." Silence on the other end. The particular silence of a man realizing, dimly, distantly, that something about the shape of this conversation is different from every other version of it he's had before, without being able to say exactly what. "I'll come tomorrow," he said finally. "Sure," I said. I have people here tonight, so don't worry about rushing." He arrived the next morning at 11, expecting, I think, some version of the scene he was used to. A wife grateful for his belated presence, a little tearful, ready to be soothed, ready to soothe him in turn for the guilt of his lateness. Because that had always been the real transaction underneath our marriage, I forgave him quickly and completely so that he never had to sit for very long in the discomfort of having disappointed me. Instead, he found a woman he didn't recognize, mid-30s, brisk, official-looking lanyard, standing at the door of my room with a clipboard. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to see my wife, May Larkin." The woman, her name was Angela, another halcyon nurse, I'd learn later, filling in for Rosa's day off, checked the clipboard, checked a laminated card taped inside the door, and said, not unkindly, "I don't see you on the approved visitor list, sir. I can check with Mrs. Larkin, but she's resting right now." "I'm her husband." "I understand. But the list was updated by the patient herself, and I have to follow it. Let me just step in and confirm." "This is insane," I heard him say half under his breath, to no one in particular, in the specific tone of a man encountering, for the first time in his adult life, a rule that hadn't been written with his convenience in mind. "I'm her husband. I don't need to be on a list to see my own wife." "Sir, I hear you," Angela said, patient in the specific professional way of someone paid to be patient. "But I don't make the rules. I just follow the chart. Give me 1 second." I heard the whole exchange through the door, half cracked, and I lay in the bed with a small, private smile that I would not have been capable of feeling 4 years ago in any version of my life. When Angela stepped in and asked, quietly, "There's a Daniel Larkin at the door, says he's your husband, wants to come in. Should I add him to the list?" I said, loud enough for the hallway to hear, "Yes, that's fine, let him in." Because there was no version of my revenge that required cruelty for its own sake. It required only precision. And precision delivered calmly always lands harder than rage. Daniel came in looking rattled in a way I hadn't seen from him in 12 years. Not guilty, not yet, just confused, like a man who has walked into the wrong room of his own house. "Since when do you have a list? Since when do I need to be approved?" "Since the last time I was in a hospital and no one came," I said. And I watched that land, watched something in his face flicker the way that fluorescent light above bed 14 used to flicker, hold, flicker, like a signal he didn't yet have the vocabulary to read. He didn't ask a follow-up question. He never did. He sat down, held my hand for a while, told me about the engagement party, and I let him because there was still work to do, and none of it required him to understand yet what was coming. Understanding for Daniel was going to arrive all at once later, in a room with lawyers in it, and I intended for it to arrive that way, so it's total, undeniable, and far too late for him to do anything but stand there and feel it. I was discharged 2 days later, and Rosa drove me home herself instead of calling a car because by then we had stopped being strictly nurse and client in any way that mattered and had become something closer to what I imagine sisters are supposed to be, if you're lucky enough to get sisters who show up. In the car, she asked me carefully, the way people ask questions they're not sure they're allowed to ask, "Can I say something you don't have to answer?" "Go ahead." "You're not surprised by any of this. Not the account, not him being late, not any of it. You act like you've already lived through it once." I looked out the window at the town going by, ordinary and unaware of itself, and considered, for a moment, telling her the truth. The whole impossible shape of it, the rebirth, the ceiling tile shaped like Florida, the 4 years I carried folded up behind my ribs like a second set of lungs. I decided against it. Not because I thought she'd disbelieve me exactly, but because some kinds of knowledge are meant to be carried alone, and I had already, by then, made a kind of peace with being the only person in my own story who understood the whole plot. "I've just finally started paying attention to patterns," I said instead, which was, if nothing else, entirely true. She didn't push. That was the whole reason I trusted her. The trap when it finally closed. The trap when it finally closed on Carol's own greed, exactly the way I had planned it to, Exactly the way I remembered it would have happened to me by accident 4 years earlier, except this time, the accident had a name and the name was mine. Priya's wedding planning had accelerated through the winter into a full production. A venue deposit, a florist, a dress that cost more than my first car. And I watched with a strange, clinical calm as Carol did precisely what I remembered her doing, precisely on schedule. Because people do not change. They only get caught or they don't. She began moving money. It started small. $600 here, described in the old business account's memo line as office supplies, routed instead into an LLC called Blossom and Bright Events Consulting, which existed, as far as I could tell from the state registration Whitfield pulled for me, solely as a mailbox and a bank account, and which was owned on paper by Priya. Then it got bigger. 2,000. 3,800. By February, it had reached $9,000, all funneled out of what Carol believed was still the operating account for my business, the one she still had in her own mind, informal and unquestioned access to, the one she'd helped set up years ago and had never once been told formally that her name had been quietly removed. Because here's the thing about the old account, the one I'd left open with its small, unremarkable balance, the decoy. I had never closed it. I had funded it, in fact, modestly, deliberately, every month. Just enough to make the withdrawals look plausible, just enough to keep Carol believing the well hadn't run dry. I let her drink from it. I let her sign a contract with a venue based on money she believed she'd already secured. I let Priya put down a deposit on a dress from a boutique that did not do refunds. I let them build an entire wedding on a foundation I had quietly turned to sand months before they ever laid the first brick. Whitfield's forensic accountant, a woman named Deborah, who was Priya's polar opposite in every conceivable way, meticulous, humorless, entirely uninterested in being liked, had the full paper trail assembled by the second week of March. Every transaction, every date, cross-referenced against the LLC registration, against Carol's own bank records where the money had ultimately landed, against a pattern going back 3 years that included, I learned with a fresh, cold kind of anger even I hadn't fully braced for, money that had been moved before my rebirth too. Meaning Carol hadn't just been planning to do this to me. She had already been doing it for years in the life I didn't remember living the first time around because I had simply never once thought to look. That detail changed something in me. It moved what I was doing from a preemptive strike into something closer to justice. Deborah walked me through the spreadsheet in Whitfield's office on a gray Thursday afternoon, tapping each line with the end of her pen like she was diffusing something. This one, she said, pointing to an entry from 3 years back, $11,000 routed through what was labeled in the old records as a marketing consultancy fee. Predates anything you've told us about. Did you authorize a marketing consultancy in your 3rd year of operation? I had not. I remembered distantly a conversation with Carol around that time about getting some fresh eyes on the branding. A conversation I'd waved off gently because I'd been 6 months into a flare and simply hadn't had this bandwidth to fight about it. I hadn't fought about it because fighting, back then, had always cost me more than losing. No, I said, I didn't authorize that. Deborah made a note, entirely unbothered, the way a surgeon is unbothered by blood. Then we'll include it. It only strengthens the pattern. This isn't a woman who made one bad decision under family pressure. This is a woman who's been doing this methodically for years and got away with it because nobody was looking at the books closely enough to notice a pattern instead of isolated withdrawals. She looked up at me over her glasses. You understand that once this is filed, there's no version of this where it stays quiet. Family dinners, the wedding, all of it. This is going to become the only story anyone in that family tells about each other for a long time. I understand, I said, and I did. And some small, stubborn part of me still ached at the thought of it. Not because I doubted it was right, but because even now, even with everything I knew, some fragment of the woman who used to smooth everything over for the sake of peace at the table hadn't entirely gone quiet. I let her ache. I didn't let her decide anything. Good, Deborah said. Then let's finish building it. The dinner where it all came apart was fittingly one Carol had planned herself. A family dinner to celebrate the wedding progress, held at her house, with a table set for 8 and a centerpiece arrangement of white peonies that had, I happen to know, been paid for out of the Blossom and Bright account. I remember standing in my closet an hour before, choosing what to wear the way you might choose armor. Settling finally on a soft green dress Carol had once told me washed me out, specifically because I wanted, in some small private way, to walk into that house looking like a woman who had stopped dressing for anyone else's approval. Daniel picked me up. We were technically still living under the same roof then, though separately in every way that mattered, and made small talk in the car about traffic, about Priya's centerpiece choices, about nothing, the particular nothing of a man who has no idea he is driving toward the end of his own comfortable understanding of his life. I let him talk. I watched the houses go by, familiar ones, houses I had driven past 100 times in a marriage that no longer had very much left to lose, and I felt underneath the calm a small, steady hum of readiness, the same feeling I imagine a surgeon must have scrubbing in before a procedure she has already, in her mind, performed successfully 100 times. Carol's house smelled the way it always smelled. Candles that cost too much, something braising in the oven that would be slightly overdone by the time it reached the table because Carol had never once in her life been able to resist adding one more elaborate flourish to an evening that didn't need it. She greeted me at the door with a hug that lasted exactly as long as hugs designed for an audience always last, and said, "Don't you look lovely?" in the specific tone she used when she wanted a compliment noticed as generosity rather than felt as one. I brought Whitfield's folder in my bag. I did not bring it to threaten anyone at the table. I had learned from 12 years of watching this family operate that public humiliation only ever produced defensiveness, never accountability. I brought it because I had learned from 4 years of hindsight and one very expensive lawyer that some conversations need to happen with a paper trail already delivered, already filed, already beyond the point of negotiation, so that what happens at the dinner table is not a negotiation at all, but a reveal. Carol had, by then, already received a letter from Whitfield's office, polite, procedural, utterly devastating in its blandness, informing her as a formality that unauthorized transfers totaling $41,200 had been identified originating from an account associated with Larkin Events and Catering, LLC, that the matter had been referred to the business's legal counsel and its insurer's fraud division, and that she was welcome to respond through her own attorney regarding repayment terms before the matter proceeded further. She had received it 4 days before the dinner. She had not mentioned it to anyone. I knew this because I knew Carol, and Carol's first instinct always in any crisis was containment. Smile through it, handle it privately, keep the family narrative intact for as long as possible. She was mid-toast, glass raised, saying something about how families take care of each other when Daniel's phone buzzed on the table, and because he had apparently, at some point that week, also received a courtesy notification. As a listed officer of the LLC, a title that existed only because I'd added him years ago, in my old life, in a fit of trying to make him feel important in a business he'd never once contributed to. His face changed as he read it. "What's this?" he said slowly, holding up the phone. "Fraud division? Mom, what is this?" The room went very quiet. Priya looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. Carol's face did something I will remember for the rest of my life. A kind of controlled collapse, the muscles fighting to hold the smile in place, even as everything behind the eyes went white with panic. "It's nothing. It's a misunderstanding. I'll deal with it. This isn't the time." "How do you know that?" Daniel said. And I understood, watching him, that he was not asking Carol. He was asking me, because some part of him, slow but not entirely stupid, had clocked over the past year 100 small strangenesses he'd never been able to name. The nurse at the hospital door, the calm where there used to be tears, the account he could no longer access, the wife who no longer seemed to need him in the specific load-bearing way she used to. "How do you know what this is? You didn't even open your phone." "Because I've known for a while," I said, and I set the folder on the table next to the peonies, and I did not raise my voice because I had learned in this second life that I never again needed to raise my voice to be heard. "I've known since before you got the letter, Carol. I've known the exact amount. I've known about the Blossom and Bright account, and I've known Priya's name is on it, and I've known, for longer than any of you are going to be comfortable hearing, exactly how this family works when no one's watching closely enough to stop it." "May," Carol started, and I watched her reach automatically for the tone she'd always used on me, warm and slightly wounded. The tone designed to make me feel that I was the one being unreasonable, the one causing a scene at a nice family dinner. And I felt, for one clean, satisfying moment, the entire 12-year machinery of that tone simply failed to engage, like a key turning in a lock that had already been changed. "You don't get to may me tonight," I said, Ebenesai. "You've had my money for 3 years. You had my money before I ever knew to look for it. And you were about to have 9,000 more of it to pay for a wedding you built on an account I emptied months ago because I knew, Carol, that you would do exactly this, because you have always done exactly this, and no one in this family has ever once stopped you, because I was always the one who smoothed it over. I'm not smoothing this over." "Emptied it," Daniel repeated quietly, like a man translating a sentence from a foreign language, one word at a time. "You emptied the account. Months ago. The business hasn't run through that account since spring. Everything's been restructured into a trust. I'm the sole beneficiary. It's not a marital asset, Daniel. It never will be, no matter what happens between us. And it was never something your mother had any right to be moving money out of in the first place." Priya, finally understanding what this meant for the very specific, very expensive thing sitting 3 months away on her calendar, made a small strangled sound. "Wait, the venue deposit, is that account?" "It's handled," Carol said automatically, the old reflex, though her voice had lost all its warmth now, gone thin and sharp with the beginning of panic. "It's not handled," I said. "It hasn't been handled in months. I let it not be handled on purpose because I wanted you to sign the venue contract believing the money was real. I wanted the dress deposit to go through. I wanted all of it built, floor by floor, on money that was never actually going to be there when the bill came due, because that is exactly, precisely to the dollar, what happened to me. What almost happened to me twice. I know how this family treats the person who's expected to pay for everyone else's comfort and then gets nothing in return when she's the one who needs help. I've lived it. I'm done living it." The table stayed silent for what felt like a very long time. Somewhere behind me in Carol's immaculate kitchen, a timer went off for something in the oven that no one moved to attend to. "You planned this," Daniel said finally, and there it was. The horror I'd been waiting a year to see arrive on his face. Not rage, not yet, but the specific vertigo of a man realizing that the ground he'd been standing on had been quietly, deliberately removed from under him months before he ever noticed the fall. This whole year, I've been taking care of myself," I said, "since apparently no one else was going to." Carol found her voice again, sharper now, the panic curdling fast into something more familiar to her, offense. "So this is what you've become? Sneaking around behind your husband's back, hiring lawyers, spying on your own family?" "I didn't spy on anyone," I said. "I paid attention. That's all it ever took, Carol. You've been doing this for 3 years and no one caught you because no one was paying attention. Because I trained everyone in this family, including myself, not to. I'm done doing that job for free." "I gave 12 years to this family," she said, and I watched her try the wounded matriarch voice one more time, the one that had worked on every room she'd ever stood in for 3 decades, the one that had never once, in my presence, failed to produce an apology from someone who had done nothing wrong. "I helped raise your children. We don't have children, Carol." I said it gently. That was somehow the cruelest way to say it. "You helped raise a fiction where I'm the villain for finally noticing what's been happening to my own money." Daniel was still staring at the folder, unopened, sitting innocuous and beige on the white tablecloth between the peonies and the untouched breadbasket. He didn't reach for it. He didn't reach for Yitin. Some part of him, I think, already understood that once he opened it, there would be no more room left for the version of this marriage he'd been telling himself was still salvageable. The version where I was simply going through something, where his lateness was a habit and not a pattern, where love could still be measured in intentions instead of arrivals. "I need to see it," he said finally, and reached for the folder, and I let him, because by then, there was nothing in it I needed to protect him from anymore. What happened after that dinner unspooled over the following months, with the kind of clean procedural inevitability that only comes from having spent a year building a case instead of a grudge. Carol's fraud, once formally reported, Whitfield's office filed everything with a precision that left no room for the family narrative she'd spent 30 years perfecting. Triggered exactly the consequences a paper trail that thorough deserves. The business's insurer pursued restitution. Her own accounts, the ones she'd used to launder the LLC funds, were subpoenaed. She lost access to the family narrative faster than she lost access to the money because the story she had always told about herself, Devoted matriarch, selfless grandmother in waiting, woman who just wanted to help, could not survive contact with a forensic accountant's spreadsheet. She was never charged criminally. Whitfield had advised me early on that pursuing restitution through civil channels would be faster and cleaner than trying to get a prosecutor interested in a family embezzlement case. And he was right. And honestly, by the end, I found I didn't need her in handcuffs. I needed her stripped of the only power she'd ever really had over me, which was the power to make me believe I owed her my silence. She never got that power back. Daniel's divorce filing, when it came, and it came from him 3 weeks after the dinner, in a burst of wounded pride that I recognized even then as its own kind of relief, because it meant I would not have to be the one to say the word first, ran headlong into a wall he hadn't seen coming. His lawyer tried, predictably, to argue that the business represented marital assets, that Daniel had supported its formation, a phrase I'd heard once already, in a version of this timeline that no longer existed, and Whitfield dismantled it in a single filing. The trust, irrevocable, established a full year before the petition, funded entirely by assets that predated the marriage's relevant financial entanglement, with documentation, extensive, boring, bulletproof documentation, showing that not $1 of business revenue had ever flowed into the household in a way that could be construed as shared investment. And then there was the log, the folder I'd built month by month, quietly, without ever once raising my voice at a dinner table. Dates, timestamps, discharge notes from 2 separate hospital admissions marked "no family present," a receipt for $12.99 in gas station carnations charged to a business card, the visitor list incident with Angela at the door, all of it laid out not as an accusation, but as a simple chronological fact pattern that made the question of who had shown up for whom over the course of a 12-year marriage not a matter of opinion, but a matter of record. He got nothing. Not out of cruelty. I want to be honest about that, because I never once in any of it wanted cruelty for its own sake. But because there was, when the paperwork was finally finished, simply nothing left of our marriage that belonged to him in any way the law recognized. The business was mine, fully, unassailably. The house sold, the proceeds split according to a prenup he'd forgotten we'd signed, back when his own father had insisted on it, back before Carol had ever gotten her hands fully around the wheel of her son's life. He kept his car. He kept, I suppose, whatever dignity a man can keep after being told, in a courtroom, by a stranger reading from a folder, the precise dates on which he had abandoned his wife in a hospital bed, twice, with receipts. I was there for the hearing where his lawyer made the last real push, a man named Feld, who had clearly been promised, by Daniel or by Carol or by both, that this would be a straightforward negotiation between a wounded husband and a wife who could be talked back into generosity out of guilt. He stood up in front of the judge and said, with the particular confidence of a man who has never once lost an argument to a woman he considered reasonable, "Your Honor, my client spent 12 years supporting his wife's business emotionally through significant health challenges, and it would be inequitable for the court to treat that investment as though it carries no weight." The judge, a woman in her 60s with the flat, unimpressed patience of someone who had heard every version of that sentence 1,000 times before, turned to Whitfield. "Response?" Whitfield stood, unhurried, and did not raise his voice, because by then I had learned that lesson from him as thoroughly as I'd learned it anywhere. "Your Honor, we direct the court to Exhibit 14, discharge summaries from 2 separate hospital admissions, 3 years apart, both noting no family present during recovery. We direct the court to Exhibit 9, a text message record showing Mr. Larkin declined to visit his wife following major surgery in favor of a family birthday dinner. And we'd direct the court to the trust documentation already entered, which predates the petition by over a year, and was funded entirely by non-marital assets. If emotional support is the standard the court wishes to apply, we'd simply ask that it be applied evenly." Feld didn't have a response for that. I watched him not have one, watched the exact moment the room understood there wasn't going to be a negotiation, only a ruling. And I felt, sitting there in a blazer I'd bought for exactly this occasion, not triumph exactly, but something quieter and sturdier than triumph. The simple physical relief of watching a system finally, for once in my life, work in my favor because I had made absolutely certain it had no other choice. Daniel didn't look at me during any of it. I understood that too. There is a particular kind of shame that doesn't know how to make eye contact. And I had given him, over the course of one careful year, an entire education in it. Priya's wedding did not happen that summer. The venue kept the deposit, non-refundable, the fine print always is, and the dress went back, most of it, minus a restocking fee, and the fiancé, watching the family he was about to marry into implode across a dinner table and a courtroom in the same season, quietly, sensibly, found reasons to be less available. They married eventually, I heard, much later, much smaller, at a courthouse with none of the peonies. I moved out of the house in April into an apartment I chose myself, on a street I chose myself, with a kitchen I filled slowly, deliberately, with things that belonged only to me. Sujin helped me move the last boxes in, and when the truck pulled away and the apartment was finally, fully mine, we sat on the floor because I hadn't bought furniture yet, eating takeout out of the containers, and she looked at me for a long moment and said, "I don't know what happened to you this year. You're different. Good different, but different." I finally started paying attention, I said, which was true as far as it went, and she let it be true. Because Sujin had never once in her life needed the whole story to know when to simply trust me. The business grew that year in a way it never had while I was quietly funding 2 households and 1 mother-in-law's ambitions. I brought Sujin on as a full partner in the fall, her marketing instincts, my operations, a combination that turned a 9-person catering company into something that, within 18 months, was fielding calls from event planners across 3 states. I hired a nutritionist and a specialist who actually listened when I described symptoms because I had learned, the hardest way a person can learn anything, that my body was not a low priority item on anyone else's list, least of all my own. We landed our first 6-figure contract that November, a corporate gala for a tech company relocating its headquarters. And I remember standing in the loading dock of the venue at 11 at night, exhausted, flowers still on my sleeve from a last-minute dessert fix, watching my staff break down the last of the tables and feeling something I hadn't let myself feel in longer than I could count. Pure, uncomplicated pride, unmixed with the low hum of guilt that used to accompany every success in my old life. The guilt that whispered you should be spending this energy on your marriage instead, as though building something extraordinary with my own 2 hands had always somehow been a betrayal of the people who'd never once helped me build it. So Jin found me out there, handed me a lukewarm coffee from the venue's kitchen and said, "You did that. Just that." 2 words. I let myself believe them. I kept Rosa on retainer, part-time, technically as a wellness consultant for the business. A joke between us mostly, though not entirely, because some part of me never wanted to be more than a phone call away from someone whose whole job was to show up. I heard about the rest of them the way you hear about weather in a city you used to live in. Secondhand, filtered, no longer able to touch you directly. Carol sold the house that fall to cover what remained of the restitution after her savings, and a second mortgage ate through most of it. I heard she moved into a condo near Priya, small, and that she'd taken up telling a new story about herself to anyone who'd listen, one where she was the wronged party, where I was the cold, calculating daughter-in-law who'd turned the whole family against her over a misunderstanding. I let her have the story. Stories cost nothing and change nothing, once the money and the paperwork have already said what they said. I ran into her once, almost a year and a half later, in the parking lot of a grocery store neither of us had any particular reason to be at, and there was a strange, suspended moment where neither of us said anything at all, just stood there with our carts between us like a small, absurd fortification. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe just smaller, the way people look once the room they used to command has stopped being theirs to command. "You look well," she said finally, and there was no warmth in it, but there was no venom either. Just the flat, exhausted acknowledgement of 2 people who had once shared a family and now shared nothing but the memory of having shared one. "I am well," I said, and I meant it in a way I hadn't meant very much in 12 years. And I pushed my cart past her and did not look back, and that was, as far as I know, the last time I ever saw her. Daniel tried to reach out twice that first year, once around the holidays, a text that read, "Only hope you're doing okay," which I did not answer. And once in the spring, a longer message about how he'd been in therapy, actually in therapy, working on patterns, and how he understood now that he'd let his mother manage too much of his life, including his marriage, and how he was sorry, genuinely sorry for the hospital, for both times, for all of it. I believed him, actually. That was its own strange kind of closure. Not needing to doubt his sincerity anymore in order to feel finished with him. I wrote back 3 sentences, kind ones, wishing him well, and I meant them. And then I didn't write back again because forgiveness, I had learned, does not require reopening a door. Priya, of the 3 of them, surprised me the most. 9 months after the dinner, with the wedding indefinitely postponed and her mother's reputation in ruins and her own name uncomfortably attached to an LLC she swore, credibly enough by then, she'd barely understood the purpose of, she showed up at my office unannounced, sat across from me in the little client lounge Sujin had decorated with more taste than either of us had personally, and said, I didn't know what she was doing. I signed things because she told me to, and I never asked why. I know that doesn't fix anything. I just needed you to know I didn't know. I believed that, too, mostly. I told her I hoped she'd learn to ask why more often about everything for the rest of her life. And she cried. And I did not comfort her because comforting people for the consequences of their own incuriosity had never once in 12 years been my job, and I was no longer volunteering for jobs I hadn't been asked to do. I went back into Providence Hospital 11 months after the dinner for a scheduled procedure this time. Nothing urgent, nothing that required a folder full of evidence or a decoy bank account or a year of silent planning, just a routine follow-up that my new specialist wanted done as a precaution. I checked in on a Tuesday morning, and the intake coordinator, a young man I'd never met before, ran through his questions with the same box-checking cadence Denise had used 2 years and 1 entire lifetime ago. Is there anyone we should list as a contact for today? Yes, I said, and I gave him 3 names, Sujin, Rosa, and almost as an afterthought, my own name, listed as my own emergency contact, because Whitfield had once told me, half joking, that the strongest position a person can ever be in is being fully, legally, financially capable of taking care of herself, and I had decided somewhere in the last year that I wanted that to be literally true on every form I ever filled out again. Sujin was in the waiting room when I came out of recovery, reading a paperback with her feet up on the chair across from her, entirely unbothered, entirely present, exactly where she said she'd be. Rosa stopped by on her lunch break just to say hello and steal one of my Jell-O cups, the same as she always had. No flowers arrived with a receipt still in the cellophane. No text came in at 6:14 telling me someone couldn't make it because someone else's dinner had run long. I lay in the recovery bay, watching the afternoon light move slowly across a ceiling with no water stain shaped like Florida, no flickering bulb, nothing at all that needed fixing. And I thought about the woman I had been the first time I woke up in a room like this one. 34 years old, alone, texting a man who had not come, believing that this was simply what love cost, that this was simply the going rate for being needed by other people. They left me at the hospital again, the second time, exactly the way they'd left me the first. Except this time, I had already known they would, and I had already built, quietly, patiently, with paperwork instead of tears, an entire life where their leaving could no longer touch me at all. A nurse I didn't recognize came in to check my vitals before discharge, glanced at my chart, and said with the same automatic kindness Denise had once used on a much younger, much more frightened version of me, "Looks like you've got good people in your corner. That waiting room's been full all morning." "I do," I said, and I found, saying it, that it was the first time in either of my lives that the sentence had come out of me without a single hidden asterisk attached to it, without the silent addendum of most of the time, or when it's convenient for them, or as long as I don't ask for too much. Just, I have good people. Full stop. A complete sentence, finally, instead of a negotiation. Sujin drove me home that afternoon with the windows down, even though it was only 60 degrees, because she said the recycled hospital air made her feel like she was breathing through a straw, and I laughed for the first time in days at how exactly like her that was, how entirely unbothered by other people's comfort in a way that had nothing to do with cruelty and everything to do with simply being herself without apology. The thing I was still, slowly, teaching myself to do. We stopped for tacos on the way, ate them in the parking lot with the radio on, and talked about nothing important. A new venue Larkin and Kwan events had just been booked for, a man she'd matched with on an app who used the word synergy unironically in his bio, whether the office needed a second espresso machine, or whether that was, as she put it, an aggressively millennial problem to have. It was, I remember thinking, an extraordinarily ordinary afternoon. That was the whole point of everything I'd spent a year building Hetzaz, not some grand cinematic victory lap, not a life engineered for spectacle, but the quiet, almost boring luxury of an ordinary Tuesday where nobody left me anywhere, where nobody needed to be chased down or bargained with, or forgiven in advance for a disappointment I could already see coming. I had spent 12 years mistaking chaos for intimacy, mistaking the exhausting work of managing other people's failures for what love was supposed to feel like. It turned out love, the real kind, the kind worth keeping, was this instead. Tacos in a parking lot, windows down, nothing at stake, no one late. I still think sometimes about the version of me who died in that first hospital bed. Not with grief exactly, not anymore, but with something closer to tenderness. The way you might look back at a photograph of yourself at 22 and want desperately and uselessly to tell her what you know now. I can't tell her anything. She's gone, that version, dissolved into whatever this life became instead. But I carry her with me anyway, the way you carry anyone who taught you something, at an unbearable cost. And what she taught me in the end was simple enough to fit on an index card, simple enough that I sometimes wonder why it took an entire death to learn it. You are allowed to stop waiting for people who have already shown you repeatedly exactly who they are. You are allowed to build your own chair in your own room and fill it with whoever actually shows up. I was never really alone in that room, either time. The only difference that had ever actually mattered was who I let sit in the chair.